So good afternoon for all. For our speakers, Professor Chloe and Rocio, Natalia and Piero from the NGO Repórter Brasil, our participants and everyone who's watching us, whatever you are, welcome. It's a great pleasure to learn with all the speakers that we have today on the issue of the modern slavery in Europe and Brazil, and always in ways to address the business models of forced labor. My name is Victoria, and here as organizers we have Daniela and João, and also as debaters Luis and Andrea. Through the webinars that we are organizing, the University of São Paulo Business and Human Rights Working Group, we seek to address the problems increased by the COVID-19, and the slavery is certainly one of them. This last week, for instance, all we saw the case of a lawsuit against Cargill and Nestlé of perpetuating slavery at the Ivory Coast cocoa farms, and the US Supreme Court just threw out the lawsuit, saying that the claim could not be brought under the Alien Tort Statute, which lets non-US citizens seek damages in American courts because the plaintiffs did not show that any of the relevant conduct took place within the United States, even if both companies aided and abetted forced labor, providing training, fertilizer tools, and cash to oversee farms. So this example really shows how the issue of modern slavery is unfortunately still a big problem in many countries, and today our speakers will bring theoretical and practical perspectives on the reality of slave labor in Europe and Brazil. We are so grateful for all of you that are joining us today at these webinars. You are also part of this initiative to bring the business and human rights field to discussions in order to propose improvements and reforms. All of our webinars are recorded and available on YouTube if you can stay until the end or want to recommend it to someone. I'm gonna quickly present our speakers now. Chloe Cranston is Business and Human Rights Manager at Anti-Slavery International. Rocio Ramos is Business and Human Rights Policy and Research Officer at Anti-Slavery International. Natalia Suzuki is Coordinator of the Escravo Nem Pensar, in English, something like Slavery Don't Even Think, I guess, program of the NGO Repórter Brasil. And Piero Locatelli is also researcher at the NGO Repórter Brasil. So I'm gonna hand over to the speakers, and to coordinate the answers, I think that maybe after all the presentations of the 4 speakers that are joining us today, we open a quick panel for questions. So I would like to invite Professor Chloe to present the topic and her considerations, and after that, our debaters and participants to bring their remarks. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Could you give Rocio the power to share her screen?
Yes, she's given that to me. Give me 1 second, Chloe, and I'll try to share the slides. I think you should be able to see it now.
Yeah.
Yes, we can see perfectly.
So yeah, thank you very much for inviting us to speak here. We're really interested to kind of hear everybody's ideas. So I'm Chloe. I'm not a professor, unfortunately. Thanks for giving me that title, but I'm very much not. I do not have even a PhD, so I'm just Chloe. So I'm Business and Human Rights Manager at Anti-Slavery International. I'll be speaking for about 5 minutes or so, and then I'll be passing over to Rocio, who's my colleague, who can introduce herself, but we work in a team together in Anti-Slavery's Business and Human Rights portfolio. So next slide. So just in terms of who we are, if you don't know us, we're a UK-based organisation, but we look at the issue of modern slavery or all contemporary forms of slavery worldwide. We're considered to be the world's oldest human rights organization. So we were founded over 180 years ago by British abolitionists lobbying against the then transatlantic slave trade. Some form of anti-slavery international has existed since then, and today, as said, we work to address all contemporary forms of slavery. We don't have offices in any country apart from our headquarters, which are in London. And the reason for that is because we always work with partner organizations in the countries where we have programs. So some of the countries, I'm sorry if you can hear children shouting behind me. Some of the countries where we have programs at the moment include Mauritania, Tanzania, Nepal, and elsewhere. We don't actually have any programs in Brazil right now, but we work closely, for example, with Repórter Brasil in advocacy, international level advocacy. So next slide. So what we do on global supply chains, so the work that Rocio and I do, we work on 3 levels. We work to call for stronger laws on business and human rights and on forced labor in global supply chains, which is what we'll primarily be talking about today. We work to develop programs in countries, regions to help workers to know and how to access their rights. And we also engage with large companies on how they address forced labor and essentially to kind of criticize what they're doing and encourage them to do better. So the next slide. So I think you're probably all quite an informed audience. So I'm just going to give this really, really quickly when we kind of go a stage up from Brazil and think about modern slavery globally. So on the screen are ILO, International Labour Organization, statistics on modern slavery globally. These are from 2016-17, and I think there's going to be new data this year, later this year maybe. And generally we would say to understand that these are estimates rather than certain figures. So what's understood is that at any given time, there's 40 million people in modern slavery around the world. Of those 40 million, 16 million people are in forced labor in the private sector. So that's when we go into the supply chain space. Of the whole 40 million, 1 in 4 victims are children, unfortunately. 70% are women, so women are very disproportionately affected. The profit generated annually from forced labor, which includes, if we don't talk about forced labor in the private sector, we talk about forced labor more widely, it also includes commercial sexual exploitation. And the annual profit from that is estimated as 150 billion US dollars, which I also put in Brazilian currency there as well to get us an idea of the scale. And then it's not a secret as well, I think, is something to highlight. So in the UK, where we have some statistics, over 70% of all companies admitted that they think they have modern slavery in their supply chains. So in terms of where we are with companies, most of the big international companies these days know they have modern slavery in their supply chains. So the question is more, what are they doing about it? So next slide. So just briefly again, I think you're all an informed audience on this, but how Anti-Slavery International, how we think about forced labor and supply chains and the root causes. So our position is, realistically anyone anywhere could end up in forced labor. We're not talking about only existing, I don't know, in cocoa in Africa, such as the example that Victoria mentioned. It happens all over the world, but often it happens to the people in the most vulnerable situations. People who are basically in a vulnerable situation that they're ready to accept a job where they may end up in exploitation. And this can be due to, for example, them being in poverty, marginalized, discriminated against, and basically having no other options. So therefore, to address forced labor, we need to be going to those root causes and thinking about how to address poverty, discrimination, inequality. We need to be thinking about the legal protections in place that allow people to actually have their rights respected and enforced. And another key driver that we look at, particularly in the supply chain space, is the role of business models and strategies. So we believe kind of weak rule of law and discrimination, business models and strategies also create a demand for forced labor. So in particularly international corporations, which hold a lot of corporate power, they are constantly pushing for quick products at the cheapest price they can get. And that pressure and that demand for cheap products and everything to be happening very, very quickly in our globalized supply chains means that there's actually constantly a demand for exploitative labor. Suppliers are always looking for their cheapest options. What we see appearing is these very long globalized supply chains with layers and layers of tiers. So, you know, wherever we're talking about from farm to an agency to this and this and this before we get to the actual consumer, and nobody's taking responsibility over what's happening. And we also see the way that businesses, for example, rely on very voluntary approaches, such as just saying, oh, we use certified products, so we have no forced labor. We know that that's not necessarily true. So we're always looking to address these root causes. And then my final slide before I pass over to Rocio. Another key thing to understand about how we address forced labor, particularly when we're talking about the laws that we need, is we caution against any policy or legislation to solely look at modern slavery or forced labor, whichever terminology we're using, as one issue. We can't separate slavery from wider labor abuses, such as a lack of payment of minimum wages, whether people can join trade unions, discrimination, health and safety, and so on. If we want to be addressing slavery, we have to have systems in place that allow people to be able to get their basic rights. Otherwise, we'll never be able to actually address modern slavery. And part of the key thing there is that modern slavery isn't a static situation. Somebody can be in modern slavery and then it may go into a labor abuse situation and then back into modern slavery. The definitions are not so black and white that it's so easy to kind of pull out a modern slavery situation. So I explained all that because it's a kind of good context to understand then how Anti-Slavery International, what laws we're calling for and why, and the approaches we take. So I'll pass over to Rocio now, who's going to give an overview of the policy developments in Europe on this.
Thanks, Chloe. Yes, so thank you for that introduction. I hope everyone can hear me. And as Chloe said, now I'd like to talk a little bit about legal frameworks, both national and international. If you do have any questions about anything that Chloe has presented or any questions about business models in particular, please do ask those questions at the end of the presentation. So in terms of international legal frameworks, we can see that all forms of modern slavery, including forced labor, which Chloe was making the distinction before, are prohibited under international law. So we have, for example, several UN and ILO conventions that are meant to protect all workers from exploitation and slavery. We also find certain business and human rights legal requirements at a national and regional level, which I'll get into more detail in a bit. But for example, the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, upcoming due diligence legislation in the EU, or Forced Labor Tariff Act in the US, for example. Then lastly, on international legal frameworks, we also have certain pieces of national laws in some producer countries, such as the ones that are mentioned here, which include, for example, a law on debt bondage in India or on worse forms of child labor in Uzbekistan. So in addition to these legal frameworks that I've just mentioned, there are also international and widely recognized guidelines, such as the UNGPs, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which I'm sure that many of you here will have heard of or even worked with. Last week was actually the 10th anniversary of the adoption of the UNGPs. And just to summarize this a little bit for those who are not so familiar, the UNGPs basically establish 3 different pillars on the duties of the state and businesses, as well as the rights for victims of corporate abuse and harms. So in the first place, we've got the pillar of the state and its duty to protect workers and communities against human rights abuses by third actors, including businesses. Then in second place, we have the pillar of businesses and their duty to respect human rights across their value chains and when not undertaking any sort of operational activity. And this includes both acting with due diligence, but also addressing any adverse impacts when these have not been prevented in the first place. And then lastly, the third pillar in the UNGPs established the rights of victims to access remedy, both judicial and non-judicial, whenever human rights abuses by states and by non-state actors have taken place. So now I'd like to zoom in a little bit into Pillar 2 in particular, that we have seen that the UNGP state that companies should act with due diligence in order to respect human rights. And in order to do so, these businesses should conduct human rights due diligence, or HRDD, which is its widely used acronym. So there are different models and definitions of due diligence, but for example, the one that I've referenced here, the one that we can see is from the OECD, which states that due diligence is a continuous business process involving several steps, as indicated in this graph in the slide. And these steps include, firstly, the identification of risks in business operations and supply chains in the first place. Secondly, taking steps to end abuses or to reduce any level of harm. Then the provision of remedy to victims. Then the next step would be monitoring and communicating any steps taken and the effectiveness around these actions that have been taken. And lastly, it is important to consider that all these should be done with a meaningful consultation and engagement of external stakeholders, including those affected or susceptible to being affected by corporate activity. So moving on a little bit, the problem with the UNGPs and with other non-binding measures is basically, as their name implies, that they are non-binding. They are just voluntary measures. And over the years, and particularly since the introduction of the UNGPs adopted 10 years ago, we have seen how these voluntary initiatives have failed to protect people from modern slavery, including forced labor. So according to a 2020 study on due diligence requirements through the supply chain by the European Commission, there's only 1/3 of EU companies doing human rights and environmental due diligence, looking at all human rights and environmental impacts. So indeed, this is a very low percentage, but the worst is that even those who are undertaking due diligence, these mostly just look at the closest levels of their supply chain. So that they basically, that means that they are not digging down to the very bottom, where we know also that labor rights abuses are even more likely to occur. So having said this, there's a clear need to go beyond these voluntary measures. And we believe that governments need to make sure that companies are legally responsible for preventing forced labor in company supply chain. So in response to this, and alongside other NGOs and also trade unions, we are calling on governments and we are calling on the European Union to introduce binding laws on companies that would make them accountable for human rights abuses and environmental damage that occurs in their supply chain. So on this slide, we can see some examples of different sorts of human rights and environmental harms caused by corporate activities that we would be looking for them to be covered by an HREDD law. So in terms of human rights first, an HREDD law would cover not just labor rights violations such as forced labor and anti-labor or freedom of association, etc., but also other harms such as harm to human rights and environmental defenders, unlawful evictions, the construction of certain projects without the authorization of local communities, etc. And then this law would also cover environmental harms as well, as I said. At Anti-Slavery International, we have seen that forced labor and modern slavery does not occur in a vacuum. So this means that environmental harms, including climate impact, for example, can increase people's vulnerability to being exploited. So the sort of environmental harms that we would see this law covering would include pollution, climate impact, as I explained, deforestation, loss of biodiversity, etc. Then moving away slightly and just for a little bit from the concept of due diligence, I'd also like to talk about the different legislative movements that we have seen across the UK and the European Union over the past few years. So in the case of the UK in particular, we have the Modern Slavery Act, which was adopted in 2015. In particular, the Transparency in Supply Chains clause of the Modern Slavery Act requires any organization supplying goods or services with an annual turnover above £36 million to report under the Act. So to report under the Act means that the company needs to produce an annual report on the steps that it's taking to address modern slavery in their supply chain. Then so after 6 years with this act in the UK, there is enough evidence proving how the Transparency in Supply Chains clause has actually also proven to be ineffective. And one of the reasons why it has proven to be ineffective is because it just requires company to produce a report, but it doesn't require them to actually take any steps to prevent forced labor in their supply chain. So in practical terms, this means that a company can say they have done nothing to prevent forced and child labor in their supply chains. And as long as that document is signed by their board of directors and uploaded to the website, then that company can say that it's compliant with the Modern Slavery Act, basically. There's been some new amendments in the last few months to the Act, which were announced by the UK government, such as the introduction of sanctions for non-compliance, mandating certain areas that companies have to report under. However, for us and also for other civil society organizations that are working on this issue, we continue to believe that even with these changes, this legislation is not enough to protect workers and communities. And then we not only need to go beyond voluntary measures as I was explaining, but also we need to go beyond just transparency measures without wanting to imply that transparency isn't important though. As we can see, this is an excellent map produced by one of our peer organizations called the European Coalition for Corporate Justice. We can see that there are many countries across Europe that have either introduced or are in the process of introducing due diligence legislation. In 2017, France was one of the first countries in the world to adopt this type of legislation with its duty of vigilance law. Requires certain companies to establish and implement an effective vigilance plans. And this plan needs to include certain measures to allow for risk identification, for the prevention of severe violations of human rights and environmental damage. Basically this prevention and risk identification needs to be resulting either directly on or indirectly, from the operations of the company and also the companies that it controls. Then more recently, to be exact, just 11 days ago, the German government passed the Supply Chains Act, which is a new law that mandates large companies to do human rights due diligence across their supply chains. Which is definitely great news. It's a law which obliges companies to identify and to account for their impacts on human rights. However, it only covers large companies and it doesn't cover the entire value chain or provide new or improved civil liability for harm. Then similarly, on the very same week, Norway introduced a law on business transparency and human rights and decent working conditions. And this new law obliges large and mid-sized companies to do human rights and decent work due diligence across supply chains and business relationships. However, it also has, let's say, a not so good side, which is that it leaves out environmental considerations and it doesn't provide civil liability for harms either. Then, so So just to say that it is definitely great to see many EU member states moving towards binding legislation, but there's still a need for an overarching EU-wide legislation to address human rights violations as well as environmental harms in global supply chains of European companies. So the good news is that such laws are coming up soon, together with a group of civil society organizations, such as the ones that you can see here in the slides. We have been advocating for better laws that protect both people and the planet. And we have been advocating for these laws for quite some time. So at Anti-Slavery International for over 4 years now. And we have seen substantial and relatively fast progress at the EU level towards an HREDD law. So in April 2020, with an announcement from Didier Reynders, who is the European Commissioner for Justice in the EU, we had the first public commitment from the European Commission about the introduction of a legislative proposal for an MHREDD law in 2021. In March this year, so a few months ago, members of the European Parliament voted by a large majority, as you can see here, to push forward with proposed legislation that would require companies to conduct this due diligence throughout their supply chain. There's Sustainable Corporate Government Legislative Initiative, which is basically the name of the file under which the proposal of an HREDD law will come, was initially expected to be tabled this month. However, it has now been confirmed that it will come in September, October this year. So that's relatively soon as well. And then in terms of the core elements of the law, some key points that have been very contentious and that there has been quite a lot of back and forth. So based on recent discussions between civil society and policymakers, some of these points include first the scope of the legislation. We have been pushing for small and medium enterprises to be covered by the law. However, this inclusion remains to be fully determined, and scope covering all companies with additional regulations for SMEs in high-risk sectors is now a possibility, but we are still to see what will come out from the proposal. It also seems likely that the application to all companies operating in the single market, regardless of where these are headquarters, will remain, which is definitely good news, as it will cover a larger number of corporations. Then another good news is that due diligence measures are likely to go beyond Tier 1 to lower levels of the supply chain, but unfortunately liability is unlikely to go as far down the supply chain as due diligence. So definitely not what we would like to hear, as we have seen how workers in lower tiers of the supply chain are actually facing a higher risk of exploitation and labor abuses. Then on access to justice, it has been said that what it's called a representative actions model for civil liability might be a solution. This would mean that it wouldn't be individual victims who would be able to bring claims against EU courts, but it would have to be certain organizations representing them, such as trade unions or civil society organizations, acting on behalf of victims. Here, this is not as good as if a victim was able to bring the claim themselves to EU courts, as we want to make sure that access to justice is just as widely accessible as possible, basically. And then in addition to the above, for Anti-Slavery International, it is absolutely crucial that the new law mandates meaningful and effective consultation with everyone affected and potentially affected by corporate harm. So this includes workers, communities, the representatives, etc. And yeah, we also believe that the inclusion of a strong provision to enforce this law is fundamental. These companies need to be held liable for harm, and it is important that access for justice for victims is truly enabled. And then just to finish very briefly on what's next, what's coming up next We are at the stage where it's critically important that the EU Commission builds on this report, which was approved by the European Parliament, and that the European Commission listens to calls by civil society organizations to design any new legislation that's coming up. And this also needs to move quickly so that this law can be designed with the greatest possible protection against harm. So we would like to see laws that properly protect people and the planet, that guarantee that businesses are held accountable, and also that are properly implemented and enforced. So now we look at the European Commission to see what's coming up in the next few months, and we will continue to put pressure on European actors to make sure that this happens. Thank you, and yeah, both Chloe and I will be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Chloe and Rocio. It was a very rich presentation. So it would be a pleasure now to hear from Natalia and Piero. And after that, we can start a quick panel of questions from our debaters and also from all of our participants that are joining us here.
Thank you, Victoria. I will share my presentation. Let's see if I can do this. Does anyone can confirm if it will work? Can you see this?
Okay, perfectly.
Okay, good. First of all, I'd like to thank Business and Human Rights Working Group for this invitation. It's a pleasure to address the issue of slave labor, modern slavery here in Brazil. And it's also a pleasure to share this activity with Anti-Slavery International, who we have been developing so many projects and campaigns for so long. So the idea for this presentation is to divide it in two parts. So in the first part, I will give an overview of slave labor here in Brazil, and I will bring some ideas about the economic sectors that are impacted by this practice, the geographic view of slave labor here in the country, and mainly about the Brazilian concept that we named here as slave labor. And then in the second part of presentation, Piero will bring case studies to address the issue on an empirical approach, give an idea how we at Repórter Brasil have been working with this issue as well. First of all, I'd like to place slave labor in the international debate because, as many of you know, slave labor is a Brazilian term that refers to our definition found in our criminal code. We are going to see this further. And when we think about slave labor, I think it is important to give a step back and look at the concept of decent work, which is not a new concept at all. It is the concept used by ILO, the International Labour Organization, in order to highlight the importance of the employment creation, rights at work, social protection, and social dialogue. Decent work is also present in the Sustainable Development Agenda as Goal 8. And here it's important to say that decent work does not refer just to the dimension of the individual well-being, but also it is a pillar of a fair, equal, and a rule of law society. And that's why when we think decent work, and we have this in mind, it is important to consider this, because if we have practices that are the opposite of the idea of the decent work, it means that we have practices that are threatening the idea of the rule of law society. And we are talking about modern slavery as this umbrella concept, forced labor, slave labor here in Brazil, human trafficking, and exploitation. All these concepts, they can be used as equivalent, but in terms of theoretical approach, it is important to say that they have many huge differences among them. And we are not going to have time to discuss it, but it is important to mention this. And here in this presentation, we focus in Brazilian concept, slave labor, as we are going to see in the next slides. In Brazil, this violation has been denounced since the 70s by the civil society, but it was just only recognized in 1995 by the Brazilian state. And since then, a national policy for eradication of slave labor has been developed. And thanks to that, more than 55,000 workers were rescued so far since 1995 until 2020. Here, the problem is all over the country. There are cases of slave labor in all Brazilian states. So here in this map, we can see the hotspots of slave labor. These red areas are the most areas of concentration in terms of the number of the cases and the number of rescued workers. And the states of Pará, here, Minas Gerais, here, Mato Grosso, Goiás, and Maranhão are the national champions in number of cases and rescued workers. But as I said, we have the problem in all Brazilian states. Since 1995, about 80% of the cases of slave labor are found in agriculture and livestock activities, but urban cases are very frequent in the last decades. So that's why we have to pay attention, not just in the rural areas of Brazil, but also in the urban areas, which means that big cities as São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Belo Horizonte also have problems with slave labor. We have to mention that we have a remarkable concentration of the cases in the region of the deforestation arc. What is deforestation arc? It means that there is this region in the southeast of Pará, southwest of Maranhão, north of Tocantins and north of Mato Grosso, where the agriculture and livestock activities are advancing towards the native forest, the rainforest, which means Amazon rainforest. And that's why we have a strict relationship with environmental crimes and other human rights violations, such as human trafficking, child labor, and sexual exploitation. It is important to say that forced labor, slave labor here in Brazil never comes lonely. It always comes with another violation, and that's why it's very challenging to combat this violation, because it requires a number of measures that is not easy to coordinate in terms of policies. Here we have an overview about economic activities by number of rescued workers. So as I said before, we have livestock activity responding about 30% of the cases, farming, agriculture, almost 20%, sugarcane, 21%, and we have construction and textile sector. Both of them represent 6% only, but we have to say that it's a rising trend since 2010. So that's why we have to pay attention also in these urban activities. Before dive in the Brazilian concept, I'd like to say that there is a great convergence between our concept and ILO concept of forced labor, which is present in the Forced Labor Convention number 29 from 1930. And from this concept, ILO brought indicators to classify or identify a case of forced labor. So we have indicators such as abuse of vulnerability, isolation, physical and sexual violence, intimidation, debt bondage, abusive working and life conditions. All of these indicators are present in the Brazilian context, as we're gonna see next. As I said before, our concept comes from the definition of our criminal code, more specific in the Article 149. And in the criminal code text that I brought here, I highlighted 4 terms. Forced labor, arduous working days, degrading working conditions, and debt contracted, because they are constitutive dimensions of our comprehension of slave labor here. So I'd like to go through them so in order to explicit this comprehension. So the first one is forced labor. It refers to the situation that the worker is exploited and forced to work under threats and acts of physical or mental violence. So the idea of retention of salaries and personal documents are used to make the denounces and runways infrequent and difficult. Geographic and cultural isolations are managed to keep the person working against her will. And this is, forced labor has a stronger relationship with debt bondage as well. Here we have a case, sorry, it's in Portuguese, of a Filipino woman who were employed by a council of the Embassy of Emirates in Brazil. And she were locked for 8 months without any day off and suffering verbal abuse constantly. She were not allowed to go over, to get out from the house. It was very radical situation of forced labor. If anyone want to see the full case, it can be found in the Repórter Brasil website as well. Debt bondage. In this situation, workers are tied to the employer by legal and high debts related to expenses on transportation, food, lodging, and work equipment. Usually, these expenses are responsible to the employer, not to the employee. And these debts are discounted from the salaries of the workers. And in the end of the month, there is no resource to be received from the employer. So the employee is kept working in order to, one day, they might be able to pay the debt, but it will never happen at all. This is another extreme case of debt bondage and forced labor. We have 100 years of servitude in this case. 3 generations were enslaved by legal debts that were created by the landowner. So these traditional communities who were dedicated to the extraction of piaçava, which is a material that is used to make brooms here in Brazil, are very dependent to this local economic activity. And they were under precariousness of work and living conditions during the harvest periods of piaçava. And besides, they had to pay all these debts, and they were never able to do this, of course. So in this image, we have the list of the items that were discounted from the payment of the workers. So we have things related to self-consumption, such as food, coffee, sugar, rice, clothing, and even the gasoline that they use it to make their job. In the same situation, we have this kind of production of the illegal debts in the textile sector, here in the state of São Paulo, in a sweatshop. The next dimension of the slave labor here in Brazil is exhausting working hours. The idea of this dimension is related to the situation where workers are subjected to work days that go far beyond normal overtime and threaten their physical and mental integrity. So the break between the journeys is not enough to recover them from work. An emblematic case of exhausting working hours we have in sugarcane sector, mainly before 2010. So at that time, payment for production is very used for the employer. So it leads leads the worker to exhaustive journey because they had to produce to get the payment. And it led some workers to die, And even today, we have some huge problems with drug addiction, because the manual cut of the sugarcane is very painful. And just to have an idea, today, a worker in the sugarcane activity is able to cut 12 tons manually by himself. After 2010, we have some improvement of the sugarcane sector after an action of a task force in the state of São Paulo that brought mechanization on a flat terrain. But we still have manual production, especially in the states of Pernambuco, Rio de Janeiro. And this mechanization, however, didn't bring all the solutions, because we had machine operators under slave labor conditions as well. In an analogous situation, we have the textile sector that is based in payment for production. So we have also exhaustive working hours. So there are many workers dedicating to this activity for 15, 16 hours a day. And it's very challenging to combat slave labor in this sector, because it is based here in Brazil in family production. So it's very hard to identify employment relationship in order to charge or to account the responsible for the exploitation. Besides, the majority of the workers from these sectors are immigrants, especially from Bolivia, Peru, and Paraguay. They are found under surveillance, constant surveillance, and cultural isolation. And finally, degrading conditions, which are related to irregular elements that characterize the precariousness of work and living conditions of the worker, and undermining their dignity. To explain this, I will bring some images from labor inspections that can make this concept even more clear. Here we have the kitchen of the work. So we have the storage of the water and the food. This is the condition of living of this work that is responsible for the extraction of carnaúba oil in the state of Ceará. Here is the storage of food, of the meat of the worker. In this image, we have the worker drinking water in the container of oil in the sugarcane plantation in the state of Ceará. The next image brings a woman in the first inspection done in 1995. If you pay attention in her hand, it's missing a finger. She lost it in the charcoal activity, and she kept working like this because she had to, as she described to the authority responsible for the inspection. This is the lodging of the worker in the charcoal activity as well in the state of Minas Gerais. This is 2008, that one was 1995. So, and we had this year, 2021, another situation like this. Even now we have this kind of situation here in Brazil. Another kind of lodging, very frequent in the livestock activity in the state of Pará. This is the workers from sugarcane activity working without appropriate protection equipment. And skipping to urban sector, we have textile sector here. So imagine yourself working 16 hours a day, seated in this chair. At least we have a problem of ergonomics here. Here I'd like to call attention to the electrical installations, because in the past it was a cause of fire. In Argentina, an accident like this killed 5 families with children in the textile sector. Talk about children, we have many workers many work accidents with children, cuts, amputation, and traumas in the textile sector once the family share the workplace with the living place. Now, civil construction, this is the bathroom for the workers in a civil construction in the state of São Paulo. Again, this is the storage of the food. This is the accommodation. So this is the bed, the mattress for the workers. This is the bathroom. This bathroom were used by 35 workers together. This is the next picture. This is the mattress of the workers. So just to make the link to the second part of the presentation that will be brought by Piero, just to recapture that in order to combat this kind of situation, we have the National Policy for Eradication of Slave Labor here in Brazil. And of course, the system is not perfect, but we try to develop and improve them constantly. In case of the Repórter Brasil, by advocacy. And considering the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which states the state's duty to protect human rights, access to remedy for victims of business-related abuses, and the corporate responsibility, I evaluate that the national policy try to cover this dimension. Of course, the national policy is older than the guiding principles, but I think there are some important convergences between the two of them. So in terms of the state duty, we have labor inspection and criminal charges. Of course, in order to try to remedy the victims, we have labor rights that we try to guarantee after the inspections. We have instruments towards the individual and collective reparation and social economic assistance to the survivors. But it's very, in the third part, I mean, the social economic assistance is very challenging to guarantee this because it depends also to the other policies in other areas, such as health, social assistance, education, and it's very difficult to integrate and to coordinate all these policies for this purpose. And finally, I'd like to highlight the due diligence instrument, which means the dirty list. What is the dirty list? The list is created and it is updated by the government, especially by the Ministry of the Economy, and it shows those employers who were found with slave labor. This document is used by financial and banking institutions to approve or deny credits. So this document prevents them to sign contracts to whom are committed to the practice of slave labor. In this manner, I would like to say that the list is an accountable and a due diligence instrument, and it constantly suffers attacks from some business sectors and some political sector because it can menace their kind of productions. And for the last, I just want to have in mind that all these discussions have always a final point, that is the survivors, who are always under socioeconomic vulnerability, suffering overlapping of violation, and very, very vulnerable to recruitment and inception. So they are always in this kind of need situation that in Brazil we call precisão. So, of course, all these debates about how the behavior of business sectors and government sector have to have their responsibilities, we cannot lose this final point of our policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. It was excellent. The images that you brought us certainly are shocking and arouse a huge concern about what we can do to improve the business models in Brazil and all over the world too. So I would like to invite to Piero, if you would like to present your considerations to before we start the panel of questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Victoria, and thank you for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure, and Chloe and Rocio as well for their presentations. I'll try to share my screen here. I don't know if it's possible. Let's see. Are you seeing my presentation?
Not yet. I think that if Natalia closes her presentation, we can see yours, Piero.
Okay.
Can you please close your presentation, Natalia?
I think I did.
You did?
Yes. Okay. Maybe.
Okay, thank
maybe
you.
Now.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Are you seeing mine now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Perfect. So I would like to complement some things that Natalia talked about, bringing it more, first, some examples of slave labor cases during the pandemic that we have been going through. And I bring two examples that are a little bit different from each other. And I also bring some examples of our work within Repórter Brasil, the kind of things that we have been doing in our organization. So the first case that I would like to bring is a corn farm in a city called Paracatu, within Minas Gerais. This is a kind of new case. It's from the beginning of this month, in which the federal inspectors found a farm where there were 84 workers submit to slave labor. Until now in this year, this was the biggest case regarding slave labor in Brazil. And that's one thing that I like to point out, that to even understand better how the inspection works sometimes, the first thing that they have found 207 workers in this farm, but that doesn't mean that all of them were subject to slave labor conditions. 84 of them were considered to be in this situation, but even though that's the biggest case that we have until now in Brazil. Other aspect that I think that's interesting of this case is that it was a, how can I say that in English, a consórcio. It was some employers met together to contract the workforce. And so they kind of gain some scale, and they can bring the workforce to work in different farms altogether. So in this sense, one of those employers was already responsible for slavery-like conditions in 2003, and he was even inside the dirty list of slave labor at that time. So it shows also some idea of the impunity that we have here regarding this case, not necessarily of impunity, but at least of the recurring problem that we have and the lack of solutions that we do have sometimes. Another aspect of this that we'd like to highlight, Natalia mentioned it briefly before, and slave labor is often related to migrations, being it internal or external. In this case, the workers have been recruited in the Vale do Jequitinhonha. That's kind of the poorest area in the state of Minas Gerais, and with the promises of good remuneration and good conditions in their workplace. And they even paid for this intermediate that we call gato here in Brazil normally. The thing that they found, the federal inspectors found there, that they were in degrading conditions. The accommodations were overcrowded. There were not any kind of bathroom, not any drinking water. and they also didn't have any place to prepare their food according to any standards of sanitation. So that's one thing that's also important. As Natalia has presented before, we have 4 things that that describes what the slave labor here is in our Código Penal, but just one of them is enough to constatate the crime there. So that was the case because the labor inspectors found the degradation conditions, and that's enough to prosecute the employers. And one thing that I would like to highlight as well, that's part of the workers took the test for COVID, which was positive. It was made in by the owner of the farm, and after that, instead of separating them or trying to find other measures to it, they put the ones that they have the positive for COVID-19 with other workers that didn't have COVID-19, but they had symptoms that should be maybe COVID. And in that sense, more people grabbed COVID because of that. This inspection is really new, so we don't have still the documents that could show like how many of them and what was the details of the situation. But what they call it, the federal inspector, that the place turned it into a covidario, a place that the COVID was spreading because they were in this really bad accommodation without any use of masks or social distance or anything or any sort of problem like that. One important thing about that COVID is they're not still, I was researching for this presentation, trying to find cases with that forced laborers were found with COVID. What we can find more in the inspections is the problems related to COVID in an indirect way, in the sense that, for example, there was no precaution to that. And because of the situation of the COVID, you have people isolated or big misleadings of workers, such of the biggest misleading of the employers, such as this one that we see here. The other case that I would like to bring is also to show that's not, even though we are in this middle of this pandemic, one important thing that some organizations from the civil society in Brazil says that due to the COVID situation and due to the high unemployment that we have now in the country, it's easier for the employers to hire people in this kind of conditions, and that's one of example of that. That's a soy farm just besides Campo Grande. That's not so common in the sense that's just near. It's a rural place, and we have a lot of urban cases in Brazil, as Natalia showed, but it's not necessarily common to have urban rural problems near big and important cities in Brazil, such as this one, that you have this soy farm in Campo Grande. Soy is not also so common. We have some cases of slave labor in soy, but it's not so common as, for example, in cattle rising. But even though there was this case just recently this year, and also to show that there is a lot of things that could lead to constatate this problem in this farm. So I will just highlight all of them here. So the first one, there were indigenous people that were having problems to work in other places due to this economic situation in Brazil. And they were hired completely in a complete informality without any relation to the Consolidação dos Leis do Trabalho or any carteira do trabalho, any contract. It was just completely with their word, right? They were not subjected to any medical examinations and admissions. They did not receive free personal protective equipment that we call EPI here in Brazil for the exercise of their functions, as they were working in activities regarding the farm that they were not strictly related to the production of soy. That would be really, really important. They did not have proper housing, and they had to build their own precarious accommodation that you are seeing here in the photograph. That's where they were living. They did not have any proper toilets, so they have to improvise it inside the farm. Also, there was no suitable place to prepare the food. That's something that they bring themselves to the farm that was not provided by the farm owner. For their meals, they also didn't have anywhere to prepare the food and also anywhere to eat, and sometimes they would eat on their mattresses. Also, for their personal hygiene, they kept the water that they took in rivers in used buckets made from plastic gallons of lubricants. So in that sense, it was something that's not also health appropriate. And also, they were far from any it was not easy for them to get to any urban center, and there was not any kind of assistance if they had any medical emergency. So they didn't have any first aid kits. So I just would like to show that all of these together that leads the inspectors to say that there is a situation of degrading conditions in this farm. It's not just one isolated aspect of it, but all these 9 elements that you have seen here together brings to this conclusion. And this is important because sometimes we heard criticism from politicians here in Brazil saying that the concept is really broad, and sometimes the inspectors would just nitpick something and say that there's slave labor in this situation. But as you can see here, it's not just to, even if from the 4 things that can make the slave labor, this is just one, you have all these elements here that bring to that. So this is really important to keep in mind. Now I will begin to show some of our work within Repórter Brasil. Natalia works in the education sector of it, and I have been working in the research. And we have this part of advocacy that's transversal to all the other programs, and we kind of work together thinking it's not just, for example, we have the journalism that brings a lot of news and about slave labor and supply chain research. We have the education project, we have our field of research, and we kind of try to work together and also do this kind of advocacy work in different fields. So I just try to mention some of them so you can get a broader sense of the kind of work that we do to engage the society in this issue and also to affect the public policy regarding that. And also the private sector, of course. This is one example that was just published today, actually. And it's a report that addresses labor and human rights violation in coffee within Brazil. It's the second that we made about coffee. I think the first one was in 2016. And with that, we could link coffee farms in which slave labor was found with big sellers of coffee in Europe doing our supply chain research. Here's one example of the cases that we talk about there. Also, just as the case that we showed before, someone that comes from Vale do Jequitinhonha, and he would say that his best source of income near his hometown was scarce. And because of that, he had to go and to find these opportunities in the coffee farm in the south of Minas Gerais, in which the slave labor was found. And also he said that there was no house, there was no mattress, and they had to buy everything. And they would have to buy even the dehiscadeiras, that's the thing that you use to collect the coffee, a kind of hand with kind of long hands made of iron that shakes, and then you take the coffee out of the trees. And they would have to buy even that. In other words, it's not just the clothes or things not straightly related to work, but your main mean of work would have to be both with your own income to work in the farm. So that's the kind of situations that we're talking about here. And here we have the findings of our research. Those are the roasters and retailers that are related to, they have supply chains related to forced labor in Brazil. So with this kind of work, I think we can try to bring more awareness about this problem and sometimes even influence the behavior of these companies as well. So here's another example of the kind of work that we do. It's just have some things that we have made, different things that we have made about orange. And to show that we just don't do this kind of research where we try to bring light to things, but we also engage with other stakeholders about the issues that we work about. And this is one example that we started working with Orange, I think, even before I was in the organization, more than 6 years ago. And there was a lot of stories and research made about Orange inside Brazil. And then later on, we, together with our other organizations, were invited to take part at PANAL. That's the initiative for the Partnership for Sustainable Oranges. That comes from, it's an initiative that started in Germany. And with our help here and with the help of other organizations, we bring together a coalition of NGOs, of the private sector, of unions from both agricultural, both from assalariados and agricultura familiar, and also engage with the buyers in Germany that have also power to change the situation here. And this is really messy, sort of complicated, but I want to give this idea here just that we also engage in these more complex ideas of governance. And inside PANAL, for example, we are coordinating the action of the civil society within Brazil. So in that sense, we try to, there are other people working, for example, with the workers, with the unions, with the private sector. And our idea is to mobilize and work with other organizations inside Brazil, so you can bring our demands and the demands that can bring a better situation for the workers to a broader level outside Brazil, in Germany, where they also have another part of this partnership. And finally, I would like to show Modalivre. Modalivre is one app that we made. I showed a little bit, it's not our sort of research, and then I showed how we also engage with other actors to try to change the situation. But we also have some kind of work related strictly to the consumers and to the people. And in that sense, Modalivre is really important for us. It's an app that has more than 200,000 downloads. And this app assesses how the main brands and clothing retailers in the country monitor their suppliers and fight slave labor. Until now, we have 123 brands currently listed in it. And we use a methodology where we use basically two things to assign and score for the companies. The first one is a questionnaire that's answered by the brands, where we ask all their internal policies regarding work issues. And now the other one is also research that we make related to the company, in which we do a history of the labor's violations. So here's the website that they have, that you can see sort of how it works. And then you have like these brands that are red, that's the worst ones. You have this kind of yellow, that's kind of attention, and green is pretty intuitive. And you have something that we don't have enough information about it, mostly due to their lack of transparency, and we made that clear as well. And when you click in the profile of each of these companies, you can have information about their politics, how is their transparency in their supply chain, how they monitor their suppliers. and their history of problems, as you can see here on the screen. And then you can see, and you have everything that they ensure. For example, here you have the questionnaire from Zara. And I don't know if you're interested to understand how Zara deals with that, you can go inside their page inside Moda Livre, and then you can check like everything, all the documents that they send. So it's kind of radical transparency in the sense that you can see all the documents that have led to the conclusion about the company. And finally, it's just like something that I think we always have to stress here in Brazil, the situation that we have with the president, that have talked a lot even before the campaign about slave labor, and he constantly speaks about slave labor. I think that every several months he would say something. And in the last one, there was a constitutional amendment that said that every farm in which slave labor were found would have to be destined to agriculture reform. That had passed, but it was not implemented because we don't have the proper regulation for that yet. And even though we don't have it, Bolsonaro is, for example, in the beginning of last month, in the Labor's Day, he attacked it, saying that there was not any sense and he would not regulate this constitutional amendment. Just to give one of the several examples that we could have about Bolsonaro. And I think from my part, that was all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Piero. The case that you mentioned in the corn and coffee production, also with the COVID-19, show how the unequal impacts of COVID on the supply chain suggest that slave labor really became a more problematic concern. So all of the 4 presentations were excellent, showing us the challenges, both international context and also specifically in Brazil, related to combat slave labor at all. I would like to invite our debaters, Luis and Andrea, to present their remarks and considerations, as well as all of the participants that can feel free to present their questions at the chat or even open their microphones and cameras. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. Andrea, I go first. It's okay?
Okay.
Okay. Good afternoon with everyone. I really appreciate the invitation. One more time to the group. It's a very a good pleasure to be here today. What I would like to do is just to try to show what is the situation about this problem in slavery and human traffic in Peru. I think that it could be interesting try to show what is the regulation in Peru and how is where is the area with more problem on this section. First of all, I have to say that the relation between business and slavery and human trafficking in Peru is mainly associated. It's mainly associated with human traffic. The human traffic is the second most lucrative illicit business in the world. This is clear. Second only to drug trafficking, and according to the United Nations. However, in Peru, despite the fact that this crime is punishable by up to 35 years in prison or more, the number of the victims continues to increase. In 2016, more than 1,000 cases of human traffic were registered, 1,300 more than those reported in 2015. And so far, in 2017, more than 2,000 cases have been registered too. Mostly of these cases, in the treatment of women between 13 and 45, between 13 and 25 years old. In view of this, the Peruvian government has formed a multisectoral commission led by the Ministry of Interior and has developed the new national plan against human trafficking and slavery. In terms of this of prevention, the Ministry of Justice in Peru is carrying out awareness campaign in school and other areas of Peru. At the same time, the police is being specialized and now is working on the creation of employment options so that people do not fall into the hands of these networks, these black networks, to apply that they have not achieved much success. Also, I'd like to present a recent case about this situation, which is called the Pampas case. And what happened with this? In Peru, illegal mining, which also has many cases of slavery, is a very common activity in the Amazon region of Peru. In the work zone of this illegal mining, it's common to find bars where also women are also trafficked. The problem comes from the fact that there are many companies that produce, for example, beer, that supplies these areas with around or more than 500,000 bottles of beer every month. And it's clear that the companies are aware of this slavery situation, on this human traffic situation, that is obviously that exists in these areas. But because in Peru we still lack of a supply chain law and also compliance program are still a fairly new issue. Because of this, the progress in this area is very limited. In front of this, I would like to comment a little part that I find really interesting from the UK Slavery Act, as Chloe and Rocio have been presented. This is UK Slavery Act can help us to deal with this terrible situation, in my opinion. This standard is accompanied by a number of tools that can be particularly useful for implementing prevention measures in any company's supply chain or in other areas, or companies in general. Although each company is free to decide the scope of its declaration according to this Slavery Act. But this declaration should include the following information. In first place, organizational structure of the company, the sectors where this company works, the activity and supply chains for the company. What is the activity, the stakeholders, and another information of the company. Also, we should know the company's internal policies on human traffic and forced labor. In addition to this, the company's due diligence procedures in relation to human traffic and forced labor in each sector of the company and supply chain. Also, the indication of the sectors or activities in which there are a risk of human traffic and forced labor and measures adopted by the company to reduce this kind of risk. And at least employee training on slavery and human traffic. It is clear, reading these options or these tools to prevent human traffic and slavery, that the companies in Peru, because of now we don't have any effective tool to prevent the human traffic or slavery situation, the sanctions against enterprises, business are too low to deal effectively with these problems. Also, in this another thing that we should consider is that in these areas we have another social problems related with crimes. It is not only human traffic or slavery situation in these areas because illegal mining. Also, we have narco traffic, a lot of business with drugs. That on all these situations represents a really big challenge for the government, for the police. These areas normally the persons who work in these areas normally make bribes on do a lot of correction with the police of the area. On that represents another problem with the not only with the government, so also with the companies who provide, for example, beer or another elements in this section or in this area of Amazon here in Peru. A first conclusion, I could say that in Peru we have a lot of work to do, basically on a supply chain law as soon as possible. In the last session of the business and human rights, I spoke a little bit about what is the situation of supply chain law here in Peru. In Peru, we are working on a draft on a supply chain law, but only for the companies who make deals or has contracts with the state. Nor it doesn't matter what is the size of the company, how many employees has it, or which areas work these companies. And I think that this is a problem, as I talked last time. I think that as another examples, for example, the supply chain law in Germany or the UK Modern Slavery Act in UK, we should know, or we should know a little bit more about what is the activities of medium or big companies, as for example, the companies, the companies who provides or who sells beer to these areas are really big companies. There are only 2 or 3 big companies in Peru who provide beer, and also these 2 or 3 companies provide all the beer in this area, which is terrible. Also, I think that a good option is try to look at the government of the government of we should look at the development on other countries. I have been told, as I said, for example, the recent development in Germany about the approval on supply chain law. We should also develop social policies in these areas to prevent more human traffic, because the government has identified currently where are the areas of Peru with more traffic and with more slavery. Basically, we have 2 areas here in Peru. One is in the Amazon region, especially in Madre de Dios. And also we have another problem related with the slavery here in Ancash, which is a region near to Lima, with problems in slavery in agriculture area. With all these elements, we can say that the situation, at least in Peru, is terrible to try to explain it so quickly. But we have a lot of work to do, and I think that this group, for example, a business and human rights group, is helping us not only to Peru, solve all Latin America to try to make proposals for a better situation on these problems that who have been dealt on through many years. And that is all that I have to say. Now I can let Andrea explain a little bit more about the situation, but at the end we can talk each other and we can answer some questions that maybe you have. Andrea, it's your turn.
Well, I hope you can hear me. At first, I would like to say thanks for this invitation to this event, which is still very important to discuss nowadays. As a pure fact, I have to say that this year, this 2021, Peru celebrates 200 years of independence, in which slavery ends. However, sadly, even in different parts of this country, the so-called modern slavery is concentrated in legal and illegal economies. The violation of human rights, such as dignity, such as freedom, always find ways to adapt to the modern times. So there are several manifestations of the modern slavery today. Two of them, for example, is forced labor and human traffic. But we must ask ourselves the following question. What is the deficit of us as legal operator or investigator to attack head-on or front this problem? I believe that of the sides from which the problem can be seen, only the state has been in charge of saying in front the regulatory side, only regulatory side. For example, as Luis said a few minutes ago, we have regulated in the penal code the crime of the human traffic, also sexual exploitation, working exploitation the same way. But analyzing or reducing the problem to the only crime norms, it isn't enough. I think it is enough. So one of the points that have been left aside, I think, is analyze the supplying chain of different companies that require a lot of personnel, a lot of manpower. And this thing goes hand in hand with a direct analyzing in certain areas, certain zones in the space which forced labor is carried out. And sometimes those areas are leader or sometimes there isn't control of the state. For example, there is a study that was carried out in the part of Peruvian jungle, listed this zone called Madre de Dios, in which the goal of this study was to find what are the factors which were no state action against these crimes. And this investigation carried out about Madre de Dios, it was found that 75% of the earning of the local in November 2013 comes from the sale of the beer. What is the meaning of this? What does the word say? Companies' beer is vinculated with this kind of crimes. These recognized beer companies think that their distributors, and there's the delivery from the companies where sexual and labor exploitation is exercised. So we can see there are many incentives, many reasons for these illegal acts to be carried out. Another point is oftentimes Peruvian official policies establish that human traffic is the consequence of illegal or informal economies, such as drugs traffic or small-scale mining. But it isn't true. Human traffic also appears around perfectly legal mining or oil camps. What happened is that crime is not prosecuted or not with the same vehemence or in the surrounds in the oil, the mining camp in the jungle in Madre de Dios, for example. All these things or all these problems obviously need economy and logistical supports, which the state could provide, but without political will, it is complicated. So we have to promote that. Well, these were some reflections about this topic. Finally, I have to say I feel grateful for this invitation.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Luis, for the brilliant remarks that you presented. And maybe Natalia and Piero would like to present some considerations.
From my side, I'm okay. I don't know if we have some comments or any questions from the audience, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, me either.
I would like just to say something because Clay has wrote something Yeah, yeah, that's true. By the UK Act of Slavery, it's not obligatory that is that the companies show many proof about what they are doing, and also there's no sanctions against companies because the non-compliance with its steps or with this information. There's no sanction, and as for example, there is sanctions against businessmen in Germany and other countries. It's something curious, but I think that we can work on it and maybe make a better version or a better law for our reality. That's all. And I hope that maybe the public has some question to answer.
João and Daniela, would you like to present any question or consideration? And all of our participants too. Unfortunately, Chloe and Rocio have to leave early because this webinar, different from other webinars that we hosted, we had 4 speakers, so we have this opportunity to hear from 4 different experiences with slave labor. And please feel free, all of our participants, to present your question here at the chat, or even open your microphone and camera too. I personally, I have to say that when I see this number of 16 million people in forced labor in the private sector that I think Chloe present us, I must say that it's a number that really scares me. When we see the experience of the United States, specifically with the Alien Tort Claims Act, I have the impression that it's not enough. Like you said, Andrea, the law has extraterritorial effects, but it's used in a very limited way due to the interpretative restrictions placed in by the judiciary. So the legal instruments that make companies accountable is really a concern, but it's not only the answer to the problem. And we have to agree that there's a great difficult to criminalize companies for these actions. So this is very challenging too. And João or Daniela, would you like to present any considerations? Slave labor is actually the main topic of the research of João. Yes.
So I'd like to thank you very much to our speakers and our debaters for such an insightful debate. I will just ask if our speakers have a few minutes to answer or comment on a topic that I would like to present. And do you have a few minutes, perhaps? Yes. Okay. So. Since 2019, we are facing a scenario very difficult regarding our labor inspection policy and also our deforestation inspection policy. We have seen budget downsizing in our mobile inspection bodies and our labor inspection bodies, and also from the perspective of the environmental bodies responsible for investigating deforestation and labor violations, such as slave labor. So I would think, what do you think about this perspective? Because we see that without these inspection bodies, Grupo de Fiscalização Móvel here in Brazil, and also the environmental inspection bodies, we can't detect these crimes that are committed. And Natalia has also presented such an insightful side what we could name as a convergence of crimes in the Amazon. We have slave labor exploitation and for deforestation of the Amazon. That was a very important perspective on what we face in the Amazon. And there is also a paper from Comissão Pastoral da Terra that present this perspective in the state of Pará. That is an important case study, as well as Repórter Brasil case study on these matters that you have presented. So I would think, what could we have if we have a budget downsizing? How can we detect these practices and then present it to our prosecutors and then to our judicial bodies? What do you think about this perspective? Thank you very much.
Piero, do you want to talk? Or
No, you can start.
okay. I think it is important to say that this decrease of investments, João, is not a reality that began in the Bolsonaro government. It has been happening since Dilma's government. Even there, the problems with the inspection were found. So, to be honest, now it's very difficult because of our political situation. Piero mentioned before a little bit about the talkings, the president's talkings. So it's very bizarre. But at that time, from PT's government, we had problem with investments and budgets, with inspections. And also, and now it is worse, of course. But another thing is that we have to identify the differences between the environment inspections and the labor inspections, because once they are conducted by different agencies, they have special conditions from each side. So in terms of environment inspections, we saw a huge deconstruction of the instruments, of the environment instruments, and the legal system were destroyed. It is, I mean, it was a deforestation of the legal system, and the inspection were with so many difficulties and challenges in terms of political development. But at labor inspection, I used to say that it's very difficult to make analysis because we did not lose the instruments and the technology that we had before. I used to say that we are not able to go further because we are putting so much energy in resistance to not lose what we constructed before, but we didn't lose what we had in terms of instruments. I mean, the inspections are happening. The Ministry of Economy is able to conduct the inspections even with the budget decreasing. And I mean, it's a little bit different from environment situation. And I'd like to say that this can happen because we have a strong bureaucracy inside the Ministry of Economy, and it's related to the auditors, the labor auditors, that they are very, I mean, they conduct a very resistant behavior over there to keep doing their job. So I think we have to make this difference between these two policies. Of course, they have intersections, but they are not the same thing. So I think the issue of slave labor in Brazil, even though the presidents try to attack all the time, I think we have a great network in terms of civil society and also government institution that make it very strong in terms of policy. And unfortunately, it didn't happen with environmental system. So I don't know, maybe in some years, you're gonna have transformation in this system that we have, but so far we did not lose any instrument yet. But it is important to think and to remember that we have suffered losses in other ways, especially when we had the changing in the labor rights code in 2016. Over there, we had important things that we missed, and the law became much more flexible in terms of rights. So labor rights were attacked at that time. In terms of inspections, we still have what we always had before. That's my opinion.
Yes. I think I would like to emphasize this difference, also bring in another aspect that's completely different in the environmental one and the labor one related to slave labor, is that the technology that you have should do this inspection remotely. In the case of the environmental issues, you use satellite data, you use PRODIS and this kind of things that you have, and you kind of just go to the place to, it's almost, how can I say, not in a derogatory term, but it's more a bureaucratic procedure than the inspection itself. The inspection was already made. You have all the satellite data, you have everything that you need. It's completely different from a labor inspection regarding slave labor, because in other fields you can do it remotely. If you think about payments, FGTS and this sort of stuff, you can do the inspection not going to the place. But regarding slave labor, you have to go there. And a lot of times, something that some people are not aware are, most of the times that inspectors go with a suspect of finding slave labor, they don't find it, or they find other problems, for example. But if you see the operations regarding slave labor, I don't have the data now, but if you just look at it and go through, you see that most of the cases, they don't find the slave labor. And for these reasons also, it's just things of different sorts in this cases. I think that we have to see the problem together in a kind of more holistic view, the problem itself. But regarding the inspections, they're of different kinds, even though sometimes they do some inspection together when they're looking for wood. I think that they have been doing some that they go together and kind of rescue the guy that was doing slave labor in the lodging sector. But it's really specific, I think, because when we're talking about, because for real, when we are talking about this problem, most of the time of the relation between slave labor and environmental problems, a lot of times we're talking about cattle rising. And in the senses that doesn't happen in the same way or at the same time. Kind of things go together sometimes, but at times they go parallel. So I think we have to really take care when you kind of mix these things. And I say also for our work at Repórter Brasil, because as researchers, sometimes you kind of look what's wrong with a certain place because you see that they are a supplier of someone that you're investigating. And then you go look and see what are the environmental problems, what are the workers' problems. They kind of relate, but the inspection's completely different. And in that sense, I think that also regarding the labor inspections, we have seen a slow decrease, as Natalia pointed out. That's something that's really important since 2014, if I'm not mistaken. Sometimes in the number of inspections, because it varies a little bit year by year, but as a whole, you can like trace it a little bit down to last year. That was kind of different because of the pandemic situation. I wouldn't mix it because like for every one of us, it was a year of exception. I wasn't use the data as a kind of normal year. And in the sense, you have just to keep in mind that also another problem is the money for the operations, because when you speak, it's not just the number of inspectors, but also the means that they have to go to some places, because in rural areas, that's really expensive to go, because you have to, you have gasoline, you have cars, you normally would have done to stay like some days, and then you have to pay for a hotel or for somewhere for them to sleep, you have to pay for the driver, etc., etc. It's really different to go for a sweatshop on the outskirts of Sao Paulo that you just, like in 1 hour with a car from the ministry, you just get there and then you go back. And that's the only cost that you have. So in a sense, even of research, because that's something that I say more anecdotally, when we talk about inspectors, they speak about it. What are the consequences of these cuts in that sense? Did it change the proportion of how many times they go to rural areas instead of going to urban ones? How is it affecting it this way? So, I mean, we just have to take care sometime about this idea that we don't have more, because one thing that I see, I would also highlight this that Natalia have said during this Bolsonaro era, that's kind of our bureaucracy is really strong. And contrary to what some people say, our institutions are as well. Because even though we have a president talking this kind of thing, we still have not just the labor inspection, but also other organs from the government or not. For example, the prosecutors, the Defensoria Pública, even working in conjunction with Polícia Federal. It's the repression side of the fight against slave labor already is still working in Brazil. Even though we had some, you can see some difference, but it's resilient. It's still working.
Thank you very much. And Daniela, do you have any questions to add?
Yes, if I have time, I would like to pose just a question, actually, something that sometimes it worries me when I talk about modern slavery, supply chains, and binding laws. And of course, it comes to the issue of how corporations do comply to these requirements. And I would like to know from both Piero and Natalia, and also if Andrea and Luis would like to comment that from another perspective, but how could we not only, create binding laws that have civil liability, but how could we help, mainly from a civil society perspective, and what would be the role of NGOs and civil society in monitoring or how could we ensure that compliance with these measures are not only a checkbox list? So what could civil organizations do in this sense, in a practical way? If you could give your opinions on that. I know it's a hard question, but I would like to hear about it.
This is a very difficult question. I don't know, because I'm not sure if like NGOs or civil society will be able to guarantee compliance, because I think this is a responsibility of the state, I guess, and of course of the private sector when it is committed with this this agenda, of course. But I think civil society and NGOs and trade unions have a big important role in terms of advocacy, production of information, and of course denouncing situations. I think the idea is that civil society can be a protagonist, or I don't know, an actor that can be some kind of eyes of society to pay attention in things that normally we don't pay attention to. So for instance, when we go drink coffee, we are not thinking about the supply chain of coffee. And maybe when we see a report or maybe journalist content saying that your your coffee is made by workers under exploitation, it might change your behavior towards the consumption. And of course, I think there is a pressure from NGOs against private sector and state, because here in Brazil we see this. We see that this kind of pressure works a lot, because in the private sector view, the point of view, it's not very nice to have your brand exposed with slave labor or even with environmental issues problems. So I think this denouncing approach is important, but in another way, I think it's always important that NGOs and civil society can be able to establish dialogue with these sectors, private sectors, and even with the state, because I don't believe that just denouncing will change this, change the behavior of the sectors. So to make it brief, I think that we have to have a lot of coordination of many different measures, and this coordination has to do not just with the civil society action, but this coordination has to do also with the civil society actions and with the state, because both together can make differences in terms of production system. If we have just a civil society committed with this agenda, and we have a state, for instance, that they are not willing to approach this agenda, it's very difficult to change anything. So I think by thinking about the Brazilian experience, the best way is try to promote this kind of coordination between state and civil society. And it's not easy because, I mean, the interests and conflicts, of course, are always on the table.
Thank you very much. If someone else would have something else to add, this was very, very good perspective. I mean.
So if we don't have any other remarks, I would like to thank you all. Thank you, Natalia and Piero, and Luis, Andrea, Chloe, and Rocio. You presented us with precision the specificities of fighting the slavery labor in Brazil, and we have geographic and regulatory issues that must be addressed, and the work developed by the Repórter Brasil certainly has contributed a lot to make exploitation case visible and foster the enforcement through the supply chains in our country. So I would like to thank you very much for all the speakers and debaters. We had here today a very special panel with a rich discussion concerning modern slavery that certainly will improve our understanding of ways to fight slave labor. And in the name of the Business and Human Rights Working Group, we would like to thank you all. And if you agree, possible questions from our participants or even by those who are going to watch later on YouTube will be gathered by our team and addressed later by email. I just want to mention that we have a series of webinars going on, and we look forward to have all of you there too. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks, bye.